Good morning, students. Today is Wednesday, 21 April 2021. This is our first lecture of the week. The second lecture, since I'm running a little bit behind, will be on Friday. We're starting chapter 8 today. Now, you may have noticed on the reading list that we're covering only one section of chapter 8, and that is the section on page 19 that starts on page 119. And it's entitled The Formula of the End in Itself. We're going to skip the remainder of chapter 8. Instead, I have posted on Canvas several pages from two of Kant's books, and I would like you to read them. By now, I hope you've read some of them. If not, you may want to stop this video and go read them. At any rate, at some point, you should read the handouts that I posted on Kant, by Kant. What else? The exam is on the 11th of May, which is 20 days from today. Today's the 21st, so 20 days from today, or just one day under 3 weeks, we'll be taking the third and final examination for the course. So make sure you watch the videos as they're posted and don't put them off until the end, so that if something comes up to prevent you from putting the time in to watch the videos, you'll still be fine. What else? I have posted on Canvas in the past day or so a handout. Now mine's all marked up already, but you can see what it looks like. It's a taxonomy of Kantian duties. And it looks pretty complicated, but we're going to go over it today and again on Friday. We're going to divide it up into about 2 parts. And here is my copy of the excerpt that I posted, an excerpt from 2 of Kant's books. Now you may have noticed in one of the excerpts, there's a long biography of Kant. That's purely optional reading for you. If you want to learn about Kant and what his life was like and what kind of things he worked on and wrote about, feel free to read it. That's why I put it there. But the main thing is that you read the actual writings of Kant. And let me explain a little bit about what they are. In 1785, when Kant was 61 years old, he published a little book entitled Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals. Now, groundwork means foundation. It's the basis on which you build something else. So the reason this book was small is that it was to provide only the foundation for what was to come. And sure enough, Kant lived long enough to produce the actual edifice that was built up on the foundation. In 1797, Kant published the book entitled The Metaphysics of Morals. So when you put them together, you've got the groundwork for the metaphysics of morals, and then you've got the actual metaphysics of morals. It came 12 years later. Unfortunately, Kant was a notoriously bad writer, and so he leaves himself open to interpretation. Some of the things he says just leave you scratching your head. Excuse me. In the second book, The Metaphysics of Morals, it's not well organized, so you have to jump around from place to place to get the same, a discussion of the same topic. So I'll try to make some sense of it for you as we go along. Now, the first excerpt from the groundwork is only 4 pages long. The second one from the metaphysics is 18 pages long. So it's a total of about 22 pages of reading. And it's pretty difficult going. So what I expect you to do is to struggle with it, get as much as you can out of it, and mainly you are to make use of my videotaped lectures. My goal is to serve as a go-between between you, the reader, or the student, and Kant. Now, he's very difficult, so I, your professor, will try to help you understand what he is saying. And there are plenty of examples which I think you'll find interesting as we go along. Some of them are even amusing. So let's get started. We're going to come back to the reading, and we're going to come back to that taxonomy, this, in a few minutes. Let's take a look at what Feldman says about Kant starting on page 119. In other words, let's dispose of that section that I asked you to read from Feldman. Notice the title of chapter 8 is Kant 2. Earlier, chapter 7 was entitled Kant 1. Now, early in chapter 8, Feldman writes, "We have considered only the first formulation of the categorical imperative." So let's stop right there and make sure we understand what Feldman is saying. Kant called his supreme principle of morality the categorical imperative. In Kant's view, morality is a set or series of categorical imperatives. An imperative is somewhat of a command, something like a command, and a categorical command is one that doesn't allow for any exceptions, no ifs, ands, or buts. So morality has the form, moral judgments have the form, keep your promises, period. Not keep your promises if you want to be popular, not keep your promises if you want to be respected or well-liked in the community, or if you want to become wealthy or famous. None of that is involved with morality. Morality tells you what to do, not because it will produce some good for you or for others. Notice how that differs from utilitarianism. To a utilitarian such as Bentham and Mill, what makes an act right is nothing but the consequences of that act. That theory is a consequentialist theory. For Kant, consequences don't come into play at all. What makes an act right is not that it would produce the best overall consequences or the best consequences for the agent, which is ethical egoism. For Kant, what makes an act right or wrong has to do with whether the maxim of the act is universalizable. In other words, can the agent consistently will that the maxim of his or her act be a universal law of nature? That's a yes or no question. If the answer to that question is no, then the act is wrong. According to Kant, it's contrary to duty, and you should not perform it. If the answer to the question is yes, however, then the act is in accordance with duty, it's morally permissible or right, and you may perform it. So Kant has a very different approach to right and wrong than utilitarians or egoists. Kant was what is called a deontologist. Now, I know that's a term I've mentioned earlier, so let me explain it again, just as a review. Deontology, and it's spelled D-E-O-N-T-O-L-O-G-Y. Deontology is the study or science of duty. And you can see that for Kant, duty is the basic moral concept. His goal in all of his writings on ethics was to state our duties, to help inform us of what our moral duties are. He called his categorical imperative the moral law. Right? He's trying, not the civil law, not the law enacted by civil authorities, but the moral law, the law of reason. For Kant, reason is authoritative. Reason is the source of our ends. Reason is the source of our norms. And we must abide by what reason tells us. That's what he means when he says, follow the moral law. So let me come back to Feldman. Feldman says that we've considered only the first formulation of Kant's categorical imperative. Kant came up with 3 different formulations of his categorical imperative. He claimed that the 3 formulations are formulations of the very same principle or theory. Clearly, the 3 formulations do not have the same meaning. They're phrased very differently. When you read all 3 of them, you shake your head and wonder, how could Kant have thought that these are 3 formulations of the same principle? Because they seem to be saying something very different. One possibility, since Kant was not stupid, one possibility is that what Kant meant is that if you follow any of the 3 formulations, you will get the same results. In other words, he was claiming, I'm suggesting, he was claiming that the 3 formulations are extensionally equivalent. That means they're equivalent in that they give the same exact results. If one of the formulations gives the result that a particular concrete act is right, the other two formulations will produce that same result. All of them will say that that act is right. If a particular formulation says that a concrete act is wrong, the other two formulations will also have the result that that act is wrong. So it looks like maybe Kant was suggesting that these are three different ways to express or state the same principle, the supreme principle of morality. And if you apply any one of them, you will get the same result that you would have gotten if you had applied any of the other two. So what did Kant call these three formulations? He called them by the following names. He called the first one the formulation of universal law. And that's the one we looked at in chapter 7, the one that we've been discussing up until now. The second formulation Kant called the formula of humanity, or the formula of humanity as an end in itself. And that's our topic starting today, and it's discussed in chapter 8. The third formulation Kant called the formula of autonomy, and that's also discussed in chapter 8, but we're not going to discuss it at all. It would be too much Kant. And I think the dose of Kant that you've had already tells you enough is enough. So we're going to look only at the first two formulations. One of them we're done with. That's the formula of universal law. And today and Friday, we're going to discuss the second formulation, the formula of humanity. So with that out of the way, let's take a look at Feldman's first full section entitled The Formula of the End in Itself. The first thing Feldman does is make a distinction, which is very common, between things that are ends in themselves and things that are means to an end. So take a typical dollar bill, or any bill, a $10 bill, a $20 bill. Money is an example of something that is good as a means to some further end. Right? We don't value money in and of itself. Right? You probably don't even take much time to look at the money that you receive in change. You just put it in your purse or wallet and go about your business. So money is a good example of something that is not valuable as an end in itself. It's valuable only as a means to an end. And that end could be anything you want. If I take $1 out of my wallet to buy some candy, then I'm using the money as a means to my end, which is getting something to eat or getting some candy to eat. So lots of things in life are good or valuable as means to other ends. Some things, however, are valuable as ends in themselves. Now, if you turn the page, look at page 120, you'll see that philosophers have differed among themselves as to which things, if any, are good in and of themselves, which things are ends in themselves. Near the middle of page 120, Feldman says, Mill and others have said that pleasure is the only thing that is an end in itself. Remember we discussed that? Mill and Bentham are monists. They believe that there's only one thing in the world that is intrinsically valuable, or good as an end, good in and of itself. The word for that is intrinsically valuable. And Mill and Bentham said there's only one such thing. That's why they're called monists. According to Feldman, G.E. Moore, a British philosopher, claimed that the love of beauty is an end in itself. Now, Moore was not a monist, although you may think that from looking at Feldman. Moore believed that more than one thing is intrinsically valuable. Moore believed that there's more than one thing that is an end in itself. He also believed that pleasure is an end in itself. He agreed with Mill and Bentham about that. The difference is that Moore thought that there are other things besides pleasure that are ends in themselves, like the love of beauty. So Moore was not a monist. He was a pluralist about intrinsically good things. In other words, he held the view that there's more than one thing in the world that is good in and of itself. Other philosophers have claimed that things like knowledge, virtue, and of course pleasure are good in and of themselves. So one of the many things philosophers disagree about is which things and how many things are intrinsically good. So let's come up with a name for those things that are good not as ends in themselves, but as means to an end. Let's call them extrinsically good. Notice, intrinsically means the goodness is inside of it. Extrinsically means the good is outside of it. The good has to do with its relation to other things. And one relation something can have to other things is it's a means to them. It's a means to bring them about. Okay? So for some of you, going to UTA and earning a bachelor's degree is a means to a further end. Now, you may also value your education as an end in itself. But if your plan is to go on to graduate or professional school after you receive your degree from UTA, then your UTA degree, while it may be intrinsically valuable to you, it's also extrinsically valuable or instrumentally valuable. It's valuable as a means to other things that you value or want or have as ends. So a particular item can be valuable in both ways. Do you see that? Something like knowledge, for example, can be valued not only for its own sake, which makes it intrinsically valuable, but knowledge can be valued for the sake of other things that it brings about. It can be valued also as a means. So what might those things be? Well, we value knowledge in part because it helps us control nature. If we understand the laws of nature, then we can help control our environment. We can build dams, for example, to produce hydroelectric power. We can clear forests so that we can grow crops. Right? Understanding, which is what knowledge is all about, can produce useful technologies. Medicines, for example, are the fruit of knowledge or the offshoots of knowledge. So if you ask any scientist, what are you up to? The scientist will tell you, my goal as a scientist is to pursue and acquire knowledge. In other words, I want justified, true beliefs about the world. And if your next question is, why do you value knowledge? The scientist will probably say, I value it for two reasons, or in two different ways. I value it for its own sake, simply because knowing how things are is better than not knowing how they are. Knowledge is intrinsically good. And also, the scientist will tell you, I value knowledge because of the good things that it leads to, such as technology, medicine, equipment that helps us perform tasks efficiently, and so on. Okay, so that's a little bit of a discussion about the distinction between things that are good in themselves and things that are good only as a means to other ends. Now, let's bring this back to Kant. Kant claims in his essay, and I'll tell you, sometimes I'll pause and tell you where he says these things. Kant says on page 2 of the handout, right here in yellow, Kant says, rational nature exists as end in itself. So Kant is coming right out in a very short sentence and asserting something. He's saying that here is something. He's not saying it's the only thing. He leaves that open. He says, here's something that's intrinsically good. It's good in and of itself. It's good for its own sake. And what is that thing? He calls it rational nature. Now that's an old-fashioned phrase. We might simply call it rationality. This capacity that humans have of being rational beings is intrinsically good, according to Kant. Now, Kant happened to believe that only humans are rational. No other animals besides humans are rational. We don't know what Kant thought about the possibility of alien beings. There could be aliens from another part of our solar system who are as rational as we are. Kant doesn't say anything about that. I suspect that if such aliens ever came to Earth and encountered us, once we interacted with them, we might come to the conclusion that they're every bit as rational as we are. And if that were true, Kant would say, then their rationality is intrinsically good as well. So what Kant seems to be saying is, so far as we know, only human beings are rational. No other beings on Earth have that capacity. Another way to put it is that for Kant, human beings are autonomous. And that's a term we've talked about in here, I believe, in this class. Autonomy is the capacity for self-governance. It means you have the capacity to act on the basis of reasons. You can govern yourself. Right? You and I can sit down and think through some problem and reach a conclusion or solve it in some way. You and I can reason with each other because we're rational. You and I can make decisions based on moral principle. That's what it means to be autonomous. It means you have the capacity to govern yourself according to reason and principles. No other animal, even the most intelligent animals, have that capacity. So Kant divided the world into two categories, two mutually exclusive and exhaustive categories. Everything in the world is either a person, and by that he meant a rational being, a rational autonomous being, or it's a thing. Let me say that again. Everything in the world is either a person or a mere thing. A mere thing is capable of being owned as property. This computer, for example, on which I'm lecturing, this computer is a thing. It's not a person. It's not a rational being like you and me. It's not autonomous. It's a tool. It's an instrument. It's something I'm using for a particular purpose. Persons have a much more exalted status, according to Kant. And now, from now on, when I say person, I mean specifically a being with rational capacities, a rational being. That's what I mean by a person, an autonomous, rational being, like you and me. Now, not all humans are rational. Let me explain that. Babies, newborn babies, for example, are not, or not yet, rational or autonomous. In due course, they will become rational and autonomous. In other words, there's a developmental process that occurs from the time of birth until that being reaches a stage of maturity. And at that point, we say we now have a rational, autonomous being, a being that is capable of governing itself. And there are also human beings who, unfortunately, who were once rational, who no longer are. These are human beings who have become senile or demented. Their minds are no longer functioning. They're no longer capable of governing themselves. They've lost their capacity to reason. So there are human beings who are not persons. I know that sounds crazy, but even Kant, once we define the terms, he would agree with that. Kant would say that babies are potential persons, and in due course, most of them will become persons. And that some people who were once persons, some humans who were once persons, have lost their personhood. Okay? That doesn't mean we can do anything we want with them. Out of respect for the person who once inhabited their bodies, we ought to refrain from treating them like things. But strictly speaking, they are things. They've lost their personhood. Okay? So let's just focus our discussion from now on persons like you and me, not on newborn babies or fetuses or the demented or senile elderly. When I use the word person from now on, I mean someone who is currently rational and autonomous. Now, Kant, as I said a moment ago, Kant claims that rational nature exists as an end in itself. And that's a startling conclusion. Let me explain why. If human beings, normally functioning human beings, are persons, and if being a person is an exalted moral status, if it's something that's good in and of itself, independently of anything that it leads to or brings about, then we must treat it accordingly. Things can be treated as property. We can use them for our own purposes. But you must never do that with a person. I'm not saying you can't use a person as a means. What I'm saying is you can't use a person as a mere means. Now, this is very, very important. So you've got to listen carefully to what I'm saying. The word mere, M-E-R-E, is the key word. Kant never says, and he never believed, that it's wrong to treat humans as means to your own ends. We do that every day. We can't not treat others as means to our ends. In fact, I'm using you right now as a means to my end or ends. Now, you may be shocked to hear that. Let me explain. I am an employee of the University of Texas at Arlington, and ultimately I'm an employee of the state of Texas. I'm paid a salary by my university, and ultimately the money comes from the taxpayers of the state, plus the tuition that students pay to the university. So I am being paid to do something. I'm being paid to teach. And you, as a as a tuition paying student, and also as a taxpayer in the state of Texas, you are paying to take this course. So I'm using you as a means to my end of making a living. I make a living by teaching students like you. And you, this may shock you, you're using me as a means to your ends as well. You want an education. I'm providing it to you, or providing part of it to you. So you and I, although we may not like to think of it this way, we are in a commercial relationship. Right? I'm in a way providing a service to you for which you are paying me. Right? That's one way to look at it. And so we're each using the other as a means to our own ends. And that's true of any commercial transaction. If you go to the local hardware shop to buy some nails, you are getting the nails you want from the proprietor of the hardware shop, and therefore using the proprietor as a means to your ends. But the proprietor is also using you as a means to his or her ends, because you're paying for the nails. So it's a mutually beneficial exchange. Each of you is using the other as a means, but what makes it morally permissible, according to Kant, is that each of you is also using the other as an end, each of you is also treating the other as an end in him or herself. Each of you is respecting the other. So when I put the nails on the counter, I'm not pulling out a gun and saying, give me these nails or I'll shoot you. I'm not putting them in my pocket and running out the door. And I'm not trying to manipulate the proprietor into giving me the nails by telling a sob story, right? I'm paying for the nails. I don't have to pay the price. I can think that the price is too high and leave the store. The proprietor doesn't have to sell them to me. The proprietor might decide that he or she doesn't want to sell me the nails, or may want to raise the price of the nails so high that I am unwilling to pay it or unable to pay it. So when I put the nails down on the counter and pay the money, each of us is doing so voluntarily. Each of us is consenting to the transaction. I'm willing to pay you X amount of money for the nails. You're willing to accept that amount of money for the nails. You're giving up nails for money. I'm giving up money for nails. So a typical commercial transaction is morally acceptable. according to Kant. Why? Because while each party is using the other as a means to his or her own ends, each is also using the other or treating the other as an end. And that means we're treating each other respectfully. Right? No force, no coercion, no manipulation. It's a free and voluntary transaction. It's respectful of each other. So, according to Kant, it's inevitable that we treat other human beings as means. But in order for that transaction to be morally acceptable, we must also be treating the other as an end. Look at page 121. Here's how Feldman puts it. Feldman says, we use other people as means to our ends all the time, and we cannot avoid doing so. A student uses his teacher as a means to gaining an education. A teacher uses her students as a means to gaining a livelihood. And he goes on to give some other examples. So here, let me bring this back to that crucial word, merely, or mere. Kant's view is that it's wrong to treat persons as mere means to your own ends, or to the ends of others. It's wrong to treat other persons as mere means. Now what that means is, Kant is saying you must never treat others as means to your ends without also treating them as ends in themselves. Okay? If you are treating others as ends in themselves, you're acting rightly. If you're treating them as a means to your ends without treating them as ends in themselves, you're acting wrongly. So Kant's theory has been called the ethic of respect for others, which is a little bit misleading because Kant, as you will see, believes that we can respect or disrespect ourselves as well as others. So maybe we should think of it as, maybe we should call Kant's theory the ethic of respect for persons. And that word persons includes both the agent and other persons with whom you're dealing or interacting. So let's go back to page 120. And in a few minutes, when we're done with Feldman, we're going to get that big taxonomy out and start working our way through it. On page 120, Feldman writes the following, and this is somewhat of a repeat of what I've said already. Kant claims that, quote, rational nature exists as an end in itself. And I quoted that from page 2 of the groundwork that's posted on Canvas for you. By this, he seems to mean that all rational beings, including people, are ends in themselves. In other words, every person is intrinsically good. Now, that's bad writing by Feldman. I have to pause and correct any misconceptions about that. Kant is not saying that when we behave, we're always good. Clearly, Kant knows that people sometimes act wrongly. We sometimes violate our duty. We don't always fulfill our duty. We're not angels. We go wrong sometimes. We do bad things. We harm others. We do evil things. What Feldman is trying to say here is every person as a person has intrinsic goodness. Right? It's that rationality that marks us out as being intrinsically good. Right? We have a capacity that is good in and of itself. Sometimes we misuse that capacity, though. So when Feldman says every person is intrinsically good, that's ambiguous. It could mean we always do the right thing, or it could mean that we have a capacity that is good in and of itself. He doesn't mean that first thing. He doesn't mean that we always do the right thing. What he does mean is that we have this thing called rationality, and that's something that's intrinsically good. It's good in and of itself. Now, let's continue with Feldman. He says, from this, Kant infers that it can never be morally right to treat any person merely as a means. Notice that word merely. That's the key word there. It's never morally right to treat a person merely as a means. That is, It is never morally right to treat a person as if he were simply a useful object for your own purposes. Now, be honest. Isn't that something you already believe? Look at all the terms we have in our language, in English, that reflect this point of view. Have you ever heard the term dissing? I believe that the word dissing means disrespecting. So when someone says, don't diss me, that means don't disrespect me, right? I'm a being who deserves respect. And you must always respect me in all of your dealings with me. And if I ever catch you not respecting me, I'm going to say that. Don't diss me. Okay? So that's a slang term that I think people use when they feel like they're being disrespected, when they feel as though they're not being treated properly by someone. What about using? We use the word using in a Kantian way, and maybe the whole idea comes from Kant. Have you ever heard someone say, and maybe this has happened to you, it happens to many people, you are in a relationship with someone, a romantic relationship, and the relationship eventually ends. It's not important why. One of you, after the relationship has ended, when looking back on the relationship, may come to the conclusion that you were used by the other. That's how you may say. You may confront that person and say, you used me. You used me. And what does that mean? In Kantian terms, that means you treated me as less than a person. You may even have treated me as a thing for your own use and enjoyment. Okay? No one wants to be used by others because it's a degrading status, a degraded status. If you're a person, your status is up here. Things are well below you, mere things. If someone treats you instead of up here as the person you are, if someone treats you as a thing, your status has been degraded, lowered, decreased. In other words, you've been reduced to a mere thing. And that's a terrible feeling when you, looking back on some interaction or some relationship, you say, you know what, you never really loved me, you never really cared for me as a person. I now can see more clearly that you wanted something from me. Maybe I had money that you enjoyed. Maybe I spent money on you and you enjoyed that, so you used me for my money. Maybe I had connections in the business world and you pretended to be concerned about me as a person or pretended to love me so that you could advance your career in that business world. So there are many ways to use people. All of them have in common the following. They treat you as something less than a person. And it's a terrible feeling. Many people have had it, to be used or to realize that you've been used by somebody. Okay, so what else? What other terms do we have in English? Have you ever heard someone claim to have been objectified? It's a common claim you hear from feminists. Feminists say that men have a tendency to objectify women. Objectify. Now think about what that means. It means, and I'm not saying this is true, I'm saying this is a charge you often hear. And I'm not saying it's false either. I'm just reporting that this is the kind of thing you hear said. A feminist may say that men tend to objectify women. And what they mean by that is they tend to treat women as though they were objects. Objectify means treat someone as an object. And since persons are not mere objects, remember, they don't have that, they have this exalted status, not this lower status. To objectify someone is to treat someone as a thing or an object. And I think when feminists say that, they have in mind specifically using women as sex objects. Surely you've heard that term, right? Treating women as though they were sex objects. And so that the idea is that men use women as mere means to their own sexual ends of gratification or titillation. So feminists seem to have incorporated this Kantian notion into their conceptual framework and into their speech. It's interesting. Um, so, um, Kant is insisting that we never objectify persons, we never use them in the pejorative sense, never degrade them or demean them, or treat them as anything less than they are, which is a rational, autonomous being. Okay? So let's look at Feldman's formulation of Kant's categorical imperative. This now is the second formulation. Feldman calls it CI sub 2. CI sub 1 was the the formula of universal law. This is now the formula of humanity. And here's how Feldman puts it. An act is morally right if and only if the agent in performing it refrains from treating any person merely as a means, period. So now we have a formula that has the same form as U sub 7 and E sub 1 and CI sub 1. Right? They all begin the same way. An act is morally right if and only if blank. And the different theories fill in the blank differently. Now, CI sub 1 and CI sub 2 aren't really different theories according to Kant. They're different formulations of the same theory. And I suggested earlier today that maybe what he had in mind is that CI sub 1 and CI sub 2 always produce the same results. Even though they're framed or formulated differently in different words, if you apply them, you'll always get the same results. Every act will be classified by both theories the same way, either as right or wrong. You'll never have a case where CI sub 1 says that a particular act is right and CI sub 2 says that it's wrong, or conversely. Okay? So CI sub 2 will be the theory, and let's begin to apply it. Notice the theory says that in all of your dealings with persons, you must treat them as ends in themselves and never merely as means to your end. So what we need to do is start looking at different ways we can fail to treat people as ends. And what does it mean actually to respect persons? Kant's view is that there are two aspects to respect. One is to avoid harming others. Right? One way to respect people is to leave them alone and not do harmful things to them. Another way to respect others, it goes beyond that. We respect others by adopting their own ends and helping them pursue their ends. So, to use some terminology that we discussed earlier in this course, Kant is saying that respect for persons involves non-maleficence and beneficence. Right? Respect for autonomy, respect for persons, has two aspects. I'm saying this again. Non-maleficence, which means don't harm others, don't do bad or evil to others, and also do good for others. Help them, assist them, adopt their own ends as your own. So Kant was not advocating that we live alone like hermits, apart from others. We live in communities. And yes, we must refrain from harming the other members of the community, but we've got to go beyond that. We've got to help other people if we're able to. If someone is known to me to be in dire straits, to be going without basic necessities, and if I have more than I need to provide for myself, then I have a duty, according to Kant, to give of myself to help the person who's struggling. And we'll talk more about that when the time comes, but that's the basic idea. Okay, so once again, respecting autonomy, respecting persons, has two aspects. One of them is negative. I'm calling it non-maleficence. And these typically are framed as thou shalt not. They're negative. Don't do this, don't do that, don't do the other thing. The other aspect is beneficence, which is doing good for others. And that means that's framed as thou shalt. It's affirmative. You have to actually do things. You can't just live, mind your own business, and leave other people alone. That's important, right? Not harming others is important, but that's not enough according to Kant. You have to take affirmative steps to harmonize the community members, to be a member of the community, a loving, caring member of the community. Now, some people think that Kant is harsh in his philosophy, and there are aspects of harshness in it, but no one can accuse Kant of not having sympathy or caring or concern for others. It's built right into his moral theory that we have a duty or obligation to care for those who are less well off than we are. So you could argue that the welfare state, the government that taxes the wealthy and distributes some of that tax money to the poor in the form of welfare payments, you could argue that the basic justification for that is Kantian. Right? Kant might argue that that is simply an application of our duty to others. Now, ideally, Kant would say we should give voluntarily, but if that doesn't generate enough resources to provide for the poor, the unfortunate, the disadvantaged, then government can step in and take money from those who have the most and distribute it to those who have the least. So you could say that has a Kantian justification, the modern welfare state. Okay, you ready for this handout? I'm going to go over about half of it today because we've already spent 46 minutes of our time. Maybe we won't even get through half of it. It's okay. I'll stop at about an hour and 10 minutes in, and we have one more full day. When we meet again, probably on Friday, we will finish this handout, and we'll be done with Kant for the rest of the course. So let's just get as far as we can. I had hoped to get about halfway through, but maybe we won't, and that's okay. Notice the title. And by the way, if you don't have this in front of you, you've got to pause the video right now, go to Canvas, find this, print it. It's only 2 pages. I've got mine printed on front and back of 1 sheet of paper. Print it, and then come back and start your video. Right? You may want to look it over before you start the video, get a feel for it, and then turn your video on and listen to me. I'm going to walk you through it, cell by cell, if you will. Okay, it's called a taxonomy of Kantian duties. Now, what is a taxonomy? A taxonomy is a classification scheme. Now, for Kant, our duties are of many sorts, as this diagram or scheme shows you. And the whole purpose of this is to put them in their proper classification, to put them in their proper places. So I call it a taxonomy of Kantian duties. So if you look at the very top row, the row at the very top, it just says duties. So this is a taxonomy of duties. We're going to start to break it down into subcategories and then sub-subcategories. Now, Kant believed that there are 2 basic types of duties. He called them duties of virtue and duties of right. And you can see duties of virtue is written in the second row right here, and straight across from it at the far right, you'll see duties of right. Duties of virtue, duties of right. What's the difference? Duties of virtue are best thought of as ethical duties or moral duties. That's the realm of morality, or what Kant called the moral law. And that'll be our main focus. But let's just set aside this far right category, duties of right. These are legal duties, according to Kant. This is the realm of legality, not morality, but legality. He called this the civil law. So you've got the moral law, which is what most of this taxonomy is concerned with, the moral law, and this is the civil law. So let's take a look at the civil law, and then we'll set it aside and focus on the moral law. According to Kant, the civil law is concerned with our actions and not our motives for acting. Morality, for Kant, is concerned not only with our actions, but with our motives for acting. So morality is richer and deeper than law. Law takes a very blunt approach. Law says to people, do this or else. It doesn't ask why you do it or what your motive is. It doesn't even care why you do it. It says, just do this or else. Sometimes the law says, don't do this or else. The law wants compliance. It's not concerned so much about what's going on in your head. Right? So you may pay your tax grudgingly, your taxes. Government says, pay your taxes. That's part of the civil law. The agents of government don't care what your attitude is toward it. As long as you write your check, pay the taxes you owe, government doesn't care about anything else. If you pay your taxes grudgingly, I can imagine someone writing a check to the government for taxes owed, whose face is red, person may be shaking with anger at the thought of giving up money to the government. The government doesn't care. You can pay your taxes lovingly, grudgingly, it doesn't matter. As long as the money comes into the government's coffers, the government's happy. And again, the government sometimes tells us what we must do, sometimes it tells us what we must not do. And there's typically punishment for failing to comply. So, duties of right have the following form. And I'm reading from this column over here. They say, don't interfere with the freedom or property of others, i.e., don't violate the rights of human beings. And I listed a few of the invasions that the law prohibits. The law says to people, don't murder, right? The prohibition on murdering. It says, don't rob people. Don't take money from someone's person by force or the threat of force. And that's what robbery is. The law says don't steal. That's called larceny, right? And you can steal either from the person, which is robbery, or away from the person. If you leave your backpack unattended in the library to go to the restroom and come back and your backpack is gone, you weren't robbed. Larceny occurred. Right? That was an act of theft or larceny. Someone stole your property, but they didn't steal it from you. So robbery is not identical to larceny. Robbery is larceny from the person. And the crime of robbery helps to protect people's bodily security. Right? When people come up to you and put a gun to your head and say your money or your life, that puts you in great fear of imminent death or injury. Right? That fear is not present when someone takes your backpack from your study carrel in the library. So there is a difference between robbing and stealing. Next, don't rape. Don't commit sexual crimes. Don't kidnap people. Right? Don't deprive people of their liberty. And don't tie people up and move them from one place to another. That's kidnapping. Don't burglarize. Now, burglary in the common law had nothing specifically to do with theft. That's how people commonly understand it. Burglary was simply breaking into someone's home in the nighttime with the intent to commit any felony therein. That was burglary. The crime of burglary was designed to give people a sense of, to protect people's security in their homes. Okay? Don't commit arson. Arson is the burning down of a structure, a home or a warehouse or an office building or a barn. And finally, don't assault or batter people. You can't touch people without their permission. That's battery. And if you threaten to batter someone by raising a fist, that's assault. Even if you don't go on to commit battery, you still assaulted someone. So this is just a short list of the many crimes that Kant would support. Kant would say, by support, I mean he would support having them on the books and being enforced. So duties of right are legal duties. The basic idea is that we must not interfere with people's liberty or property, and the law will punish people when they do that. So let's turn now to the main heading right here, duties of virtue. We're now in the realm of morality, and we're going to stay there the rest of the discussion today and Friday. Kant divides duties of virtue into two basic types. Some of our duties, and you know this already, some duties are to ourselves. Other duties are to others, other than ourselves. Now, we already talked about this when we looked at Kant's famous 4 examples. 2 of them were duties to oneself, 2 of them were duties to others. So that's a distinction we don't need to belabor. We've already talked about it. Now look at the part of the diagram or taxonomy under duties to self. Do you see it? It's right here. Duties to self. Notice if you go down one level, there's another distinction. And the distinction can be put in many different ways. I chose the terms negative and positive. And those terms come from Kant. Kant says our duties to ourselves are either negative or positive. Now, what does he mean by that? Negative duties say, don't do such and such to yourself. Positive duties say, do such and such to yourself or for yourself. Negative duties tell you what not to do. Positive duties tell you what you are affirmatively required to do. They're duties. Sometimes you have a duty to act. Sometimes you have a duty to omit to act or to refrain from acting. Now you'll notice there are footnotes. Footnote 1 appears after the word negative. So let's read that footnote. These negative duties are also known as formal duties, limiting duties, negative duties, that's the term I chose, perfect duties, that's a term you know from our discussion of chapter 7, narrow duties, duties of omission, owed duties, necessary duties, and duties of respect. Now, where did all those terms come from? They all came from Kant. They all came from Kant. I can point exactly for each of these words, I can point to a place in Kant where he uses that word. That's part of what makes Kant such a terrible writer. He uses a proliferation of terms when he could have chosen one term and used it consistently. He used all of these words to describe what I'm calling negative duties. Another term for this class of duties is non-maleficence, which means do no harm. Remember I talked about that a moment ago? These duties all tell you don't harm yourself in the following ways. These duties are proscriptions. They proscribe certain acts. That means they rule them out. And they have the form, thou shalt not do X. The X, of course, is replaced by a description of an act. Failure to fulfill negative duties, according to Kant, quote, infringes upon a man's lawful claim and wrongs him. So when you fail to fulfill a negative duty, you wrong somebody. You not only act wrongly, you not only act contrary to your duty, but there's a real wrong being done to a particular person. That's the person you have harmed. You'll see in a moment that with the other duties, the positive duties, there's nobody who's wronged by it. Nobody can claim to have his or her rights violated. So only negative duties have a wronged party, a person whose rights have been violated. According to a philosopher named Paul Formosa, who is a Kant scholar, and from whom I've learned a lot about Kant. According to Formosa, these duties, these negative duties, quote, forbid us from unjustifiably damaging, destroying, interfering with the proper exercise of, or expressing disrespect for the rational capacities of any person. So that's the function. The function of these negative duties to ourselves or others, later we're going to see others. Right now we're focusing on negative duties to oneself. They're designed to keep us from damaging or destroying the exercise of our own rational faculties. And we'll say more about that with some examples shortly. And that's it. That's footnote number 1. Let's turn to footnote number 2. Notice the footnote appears under duties to self after the word positive. And I have to turn my sheet over for this one. Footnote 2. These duties, which I'm calling positive, are also known as material duties as opposed to formal, widening duties as opposed to limiting. They're called positive duties as opposed to negative. They're called imperfect duties as opposed to perfect. They're called wide duties as opposed to narrow duties. They're called duties of commission as opposed to duties of omission. They're called meritorious duties as opposed to owed duties. They're called contingent duties as opposed to necessary duties. And they're called duties of love as opposed to duties of respect. Notice, each of these terms has a corresponding term in footnote 1, and they're all in the same order. That's why you saw me flipping this. What corresponds to wide duty? Narrow duty. What corresponds to meritorious duties? Owed duties. Okay? All of these terms are from Kant. Talk about confusing. So from now on, we're going to simplify things. We're going to call them negative duties and positive duties. Right? We're going to try to be consistent in using those terms. I'm continuing to read in footnote 2. Another term for this class of duties is beneficence, which means do good. These duties are prescriptions. Remember in footnote 1, we had proscriptions. They proscribe certain behavior. These duties are prescriptions. They prescribe certain behavior. Right? Negative duties tell you, don't do this. Positive duties tell you, do this. So their form is, thou shalt do X, rather than thou shalt not do X. Failure to fulfill positive duties does not wrong anyone. So if you fail to fulfill your positive duties to yourself, you don't wrong yourself. And later we'll see that if you fail to fulfill positive duties to others, you don't wrong anyone else either, because no one has a right to your assistance or help. You have to help, but you get to decide whom to help. And that means nobody can say, you had a duty to help me and you didn't. Right? No one can say that. So no one has a right to your assistance, but everyone has a right to your forbearance. Everyone has a right not to be harmed by you. No one has a right to be helped by you. Right? So if we want to put it in terms of rights, that's how it would go. According to Formosa, these duties positively demand that we actively develop and further the rational capacities in ourselves and others. So I quoted Formosa. There are a lot of Kant scholars. I quoted Formosa because he's a good Kant scholar. He knows what he's talking about. And I like the way he formulated these two types of duty, negative and positive. And I thought it would help you understand the distinction. Okay, so where are we? We're looking at duties to self, right over here. You now know that there are negative duties and positive duties to yourself. Negative duties say, don't act contrary to the end of your nature. They say, preserve and respect your rational capacities. So negative duties to yourself tell you, don't do certain things to yourself that are harmful. And we'll look at some examples next time. Look under positive duties to self. It says, adopt for yourself certain ends. Perfect yourself. Develop or further your rational capacities. Become worthy of the humanity that dwells within you. Become worthy of it. You have something special that no other animal has, this rational, autonomous nature. And you should act as though you were worthy of it. Right? Maybe you did nothing to deserve it, but it is an attribute of yours. It's something you find yourself with, and you should honor it rather than dishonor it. You should respect it rather than disrespect it. You should make yourself worthy of it. Right? Don't reduce yourself to the low level of an animal or any other mere thing. Right? Respect your rationality, your autonomy. Don't take it for granted. Make sure you put it to proper use and make sure you develop it. All right, I need to bring this lecture to a close in the next 5 minutes. So I'm just going to sketch out the next two distinctions. And when we meet again on Friday, we're going to pick up where we left off and we're going to finish this whole taxonomy. So what I want you to look at right now is look at the category headed natural. Right? These are negative, not natural. Negative duties to self. Okay? Negative duties to self. And you'll see under there, I make a distinction between, actually Kant makes a distinction between negative duties that we have to ourselves as animals and negative duties that we have to ourselves as moral beings. Now that may sound crazy to you, but here's what Kant is saying. Each of us has two aspects. Each of us, you and I, and every other person, is not just a moral being, not just a person, but we're also animals. Right? We must never forget that we are animals like dogs, cats, cows, pigs, chickens, sheep, and so on. We are animals. We have bodies. We're embodied beings. We're not angels. We're rational animals. That term comes from Aristotle, but it's one that Kant would wholeheartedly endorse. We're rational animals. We have duties to ourselves as animals, and we have duties to ourselves as rational, moral beings. And we're going to look at examples of each of those categories next time. The other distinction I want to draw is in the category of positive duties to self. And you'll notice just below that heading, I make a distinction between natural perfection and moral perfection. Now, positive duties tell you to perfect yourself. Right? Work on perfecting yourself as a person. There are two aspects to the self. You're an animal and you're a rational being. You should perfect yourself naturally, right? Make sure you take steps to cultivate your natural powers, right? Make sure you acquire knowledge. Make sure you acquire skills. Become useful to yourself and others. That's called natural perfection. There's also moral perfection. You're a rational, moral being, an autonomous being. You make moral decisions every day, and you strive to act rightly. Right? That's what a rational person does. Kant says that you have a positive duty to yourself to perfect your moral self. And that means you should strive not only to do the right thing, but to do it for the right reason. And if you can bring yourself to do that, you will rise from the depths of animals and become angelic. Now, you'll become more like the angels, maybe even more like God. You will be doing the right thing for the right reason. What is the right reason, according to Kant? It's doing your duty for the sake of duty. That's the most exalted motive there can be, according to Kant. He says that not all right acts are worthy, morally speaking. Some are not. Only those right acts that are motivated in the right way are worthy. morally worthy. And what is the correct motive? The motive is doing your duty simply and solely because you recognize that it's your duty. So do your duty, of course, but strive to do it for the right reason, the proper reason, the worthy reason. You should always have before your mind the moral law. And your motive should always be to bring your actions into conformity with that law. So it's the recognition of the law that motivates you to act. And if you could ever bring that off completely, you would be a God. You would be holy. In fact, Kant says, be holy. Does he think that any human could ever actually be holy? No. Only God is holy in that sense. But humans can move closer to holiness during the course of their lives. That means bringing your motives under voluntary control, right? Trying to make your motive doing your duty for the sake of duty. All right, so we're going to make that distinction as well starting on Friday. Well, that's enough for today. I didn't know how far I'd get. I didn't get as far as I hoped or expected, but we're still in good shape. We have one more lecture period. When we meet on Friday, the second lecture of the week, I'm going to discuss examples of each of these duties. The first column, second column, third and fourth. And then we're going to move over and begin discussing duties to others. And we're going to break it down in a similar way. And I think you're going to enjoy some of the examples that Kant gives. Some of them are a little bit amusing and even funny, but it's all meant to be deadly serious stuff. So have a good day and a good tomorrow. Look for my second video sometime on Friday. I always send you an email when it's posted. See you then.